Okay, hello everyone. Most of you know me, but like Dr. Hammer said, my name is Lubischer. Before I even get started, I'm actually going to hand you around some chocolate for you all. So if you get anything out of today, at least you got a piece of chocolate. And if you would, open this and eat it. We need it in about 2 slides. So. And also, before I dive in, just want to give a big thank you to Dr. Hammer. He's advised me the past 2 semesters, and neither of us really knew what we were doing, but it went smoothly, and he was always there when I needed help, and yeah, so thank you, Dr. Hammer. He also kind of touched on this, but I am a senior, taking a gap year to apply to PA school this summer, and another kudos to Dr. Hammer. He was kind of the reason why I got interested in this topic. So in his plant science class, he kind of briefly touched on this when we were learning about the cocoa plant and kind of caught my interest. So when I was exploring some topics, this was one that I landed on. Okay, so what is the dark side of chocolate? What are we going to talk about today? So chocolate is oftentimes tied to comfort. So as I look at all of you who are not enjoying your chocolate, it is oftentimes tied to a moment of joy, a moment of comfort, something that you can kind of indulge in. But under that, there's a harsher reality. So there are over 1 million children in West Africa who are working in hazardous conditions in cocoa farms in order to basically meet global demand and put this chocolate in your hand. And despite major chocolate companies knowing about this exploitation, their efforts to kind of get rid of it have done very little. So like I said, the chocolate industry is a massive industry. In 2024 alone, they brought in $130.7 billion in profit. And a lot of this money flows through just a few major chocolate companies. So a few that you've probably heard of: Hershey, Nestle, Mars. These 3 are kind of at the top of that list. So where we kind of start to see that disconnect is we have this huge industry, and over 70% of the cocoa is coming from just 4 African countries, with Côte d'Ivoire alone producing about 40%. So if you take a look at that pie chart, Côte d'Ivoire is also known as the Ivory Coast, so they obviously have a big proportion there, along with Ghana, Nigeria, and then Cameroon being those other 3 countries. So ultimately, who's responsible for this exploitation? Like we said, large chocolate companies. They've pledged to make changes, but very little has ultimately come out of that. Governments in these areas are often corrupted, or they have weak infrastructure, so there's not a lot that their laws can do. And then lastly, us consumers. Obviously, I was unaware of this until I learned about it in plant science class, and some of you are probably unaware as well. And even if consumers are aware, they might choose to ignore it so they can keep enjoying their sweet treat. And so now that you have a little bit of a background, throughout this presentation we'll dive a little bit deeper. So first of all, we'll look at the history of the chocolate industry, and then we'll move on to the process of harvesting. And then current child labor practices, learn a little bit about chocolate industry ethics and criticism of that. And then we'll look at efforts at reform and the limits there. And then lastly, we will touch on possible solutions. So starting off with the history, chocolate's story begins in Central and South America, 10,000 to 15,000 years ago. The Olmecs, the Mayans, and the Aztecs, which you can kind of see when they were around on that timeline there, they were the first people to kind of touch into chocolate. So what they did is they enjoyed it as a drink, and this was kind of a delicacy, so it was reserved for the upper classes. You weren't going to see it among commoners, and they used it in spiritual practices as well, and then also as a form of currency. So moving down the timeline just a little bit, in 1528, Hernando Cortez, which was the governor of New Spain at the time, he enjoyed this chocolate drink with the Aztec emperor. And ultimately, he kind of fell in love with this, and he brought it back to New Spain with him. They kept it secret for a while. They didn't really want to share it with the rest of the world. But eventually, in 1585, they sent their first shipment of cocoa beans to the Iberian Peninsula. And from there on out, they continued to send shipments all over Europe. And then in the early 17th and 18th centuries, a lot of other European powers wanted to get involved. So they started building cocoa plantations in Brazil, the Caribbean, and then also in Asia. And then moving on to the early 19th century, we see this transition from chocolate kind of being a delicacy to something that could be enjoyed as a cheap treat. A lot of people were able to get a hold of it. And this was due to new technologies such as the cocoa press, which you see in that picture there, and then the conching machine. So at this time, we see enslaved Africans working on cocoa farms in the colonies. But in the late 18 to early 1900s, slavery becomes abolished. So ultimately, they had to find a new place to source their cocoa. So they looked to West Africa, where the climate was perfect to have a cocoa plantation, and there also was a lot of cheap labor here. So a lot of times workers were tricked into debt. They were tricked into contracts with their employees that they weren't able to escape. And the African islands that they landed on here were Sao Tome and Principe, which you can see on that little arrow there. They're obviously very small, which is crazy to think because in the early 1900s, these were actually nicknamed the Chocolate Islands as they were the biggest producers of cocoa worldwide. So continuing down this timeline, in the early 1900s, Cadbury was one of the large chocolate producers, and they still are today. And they were sourcing about half their cocoa from Sao Tome, which we just touched on. So a journalist found out about this, and ultimately he published a series of articles in order to expose Cadbury and other chocolate companies that were sourcing from this area. And this was in 1906. So ultimately what happened, they faced a lot of public backlash, and Cadbury even faced some legal action as well. So that made them have to shift their sourcing once again. But unfortunately, they stayed in West Africa on two other islands called Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, which we kind of touched on earlier. You can see them in that picture there. So how did history impact today's chocolate industry? Obviously, the last two places we landed on were Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, and in today's world, they're still producing about 60% of the chocolate that we consume. And we're still having just a few major companies kind of control the chocolate industry. The big five is what they call them, so that's Mars, Nestle, Hershey's, Cadbury, and Ferrero. And although these chocolate companies have acknowledged the chocolate in their supply chains, and we are seeing some ethical initiatives as well, these are only covering just a small fraction of the chocolate that we consume. So there's still a lot to be done. So moving on to the process of harvesting. The cocoa tree requires a hot, moist climate and shaded soil, so often you'll find them in West Africa and Latin America. They require shade, so a lot of times they're going to be planted near other trees that might be taller than them, so they can get some shade in that way. And then in order to plant these, oftentimes they clear new forests, so that way there's no disease and pests, which is another hidden truth of your cocoa, is oftentimes it causes a lot of deforestation. So how do we get from this tree to the cocoa beans? These trees will produce about 1,000 blossoms, but only about 20 to 30 of them get pollinated because they have a very intricate shape. So once they get pollinated, they'll form into these cocoa pods, which you can see on that middle picture there. And then inside the cocoa pods is those cocoa beans. Once the beans are extracted by hand from inside the pods, they undergo the two-stage process, fermentation first, which is 5 to 8 days, and then the drying stage takes about 5 to 12 days. And this is where that chocolate flavor kind of develops. So although I went through that harvesting process pretty quick, it is a very detailed process, and it might seem like it's not very hazardous work, but you have to think that children are performing every single step. So in order to plant these trees, they're clearing the land. They're operating chainsaws, they're using pesticides, and they do not have the proper tools to be operating pesticides, so they get a lot of exposure from that. And then these trees can be up to 15 feet tall, so they're up there with machetes cutting these pods off the trees. Once they have the pods down, they use another sharp tool to open the pod and then extract the beans by hand. Also, once they have the pods off the trees, they're carrying them back to the farm to be sorted. They can be carrying bags that are up to 100 pounds. And this is on uneven land or on muddy land as well, and they might not even have shoes. And a lot of times they're working 10 to 12 hours a day. In very hazardous conditions. Obviously, it's a very hot climate, so that takes a toll as well. So what is the cost of children performing every single step here? Common injuries, sprains, fractures, lacerations, severed fingers is a big one as well. And then with exposure to pesticides, you're going to see rashes, nausea, and headaches. And then obviously, like we said, they're working long days, so you're going to see heat exhaustion and dehydration. The water that they have is also contaminated, so it's not doing them much good. So moving on to current child labor practices. Throughout the next few slides, this will kind of touch on what the root causes of child labor is. So number one, what is child labor? I got this definition from the International Labor Organization. You can read it off the screen, but it is work that deprives children of their childhood, their potential, and their dignity, and that is harmful to physical and mental development. This kind of labor is either mentally, physically, socially, or morally dangerous to children and or interferes with children's schooling. So I'm going to have all of you guys raise your hand if you think that the work that I just described that these children are doing would fall under this definition. Exactly. So it's pretty clear that this is a form of exploitation for these children, and even the International Labor Organization clarifies that approximately 1.56 million children in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire were involved in child labor through harvesting and processing cocoa beans. So moving on, a lot of people want to blame the farmers. They say, well, why are the farmers hiring children when they can just hire adult workers? Well, ultimately, we have the global chocolate industry making about $263 billion a year on average, while the farmers, the ones producing the main ingredient, are only making less than $1 a day. The income they earn is 40% below the living wage that is needed. So ultimately, they turn to child labor. They don't have to pay the children, or they have to pay them very little. So this is a lot easier than them hiring adult workers. And I thought this graphic was kind of interesting. The title there is each stakeholder share in the cocoa supply chain, and you can see that farmers have just 6.6% of that total share. So moving on, child trafficking is another thing that takes place in this industry. A lot of the neighboring regions to cocoa growing areas are very, very poor. Two that came up quite often were Burkina Faso and Mali. So what happens is you have traffickers in these areas that are promising children either a job, or in one store I read, they promised the kid a bike and he followed them all the way to these other countries. So they're sold for as little as $34 according to one source. And once they get there, they're basically forced to work for years. They have no way back to their family, obviously. They're a whole other country away, and they also don't have any money either. Another reason for child labor is due to the lack of educational opportunities. So in these cocoa growing areas, there might not be any schools at all, or if there are, a lot of people cannot afford to send their children there. So ultimately, they end up working on these farms. And in cocoa growing regions today, there are around 60% of children from farming families are involved in cocoa labor. So I kind of put this in here to emphasize the cycle that you see in this industry. So you might have a farmer who owns a cocoa plantation who is obviously making not a lot of earnings, so he can't afford to send his children to school, so he believes the best way to give his children a better future is to help them learn about this industry and ultimately put them to work on cocoa farms. So lastly, the supply chains are very complex in this industry. So if you see this graphic here, from the farmer to the consumer, there's obviously a lot of different middlemen involved. So only about 22% of cocoa can actually be traced back to the original farm that it was grew on. So if you think about this, a lot of child labor gets hidden when you can't even trace the original cocoa back to the original farm. So looking at our checklist here of why child labor exists, number one, crushing poverty. This has to do a lot with the trafficking or not being able to send their kids to school. Poor farmer pay, so they obviously have to resort to children rather than adult workers. Weak enforcement of child labor laws. Obviously, these governments are corrupted, so their laws aren't doing very much. And then complicated, untraceable supply chains, like we just touched on. And then lastly, minimal accountability from the chocolate companies. So this is what we will get into next. So this slide just kind of highlights the violation of human rights that these children are undergoing. So their rights are being violated in the form of safety, education, and freedom from harm. Like we touched on, many children are trafficked here. They're forced to work long hours, and they're exposed to hazardous conditions, often all under the age of 14. And on top of this, their living conditions are quite inhumane. So If they're lucky, they might be sleeping on some wooden planks. They don't have access to sanitation such as showers or clean bathrooms, and then they're being fed the cheapest food available along with very contaminated water on top of that. And to make things even worse, there has been reports of physical and sexual abuse on these farms as well. So this often is done by the supervisors or plantation guards or things like that. And then somehow, to get even worse, they're often being paid no compensation like we just said. So as you can see, with all of this built up on top of each other, these children don't really have much of a future prospect. Over the last 2 decades, growing public outrage has forced companies to acknowledge the child labor in their supply chains. So we've seen a lot of documentaries like this one on the screen here. The Human Rights Watch has done a lot to shine a spotlight on these abuses. And while some companies have promised reforms, ultimately these reforms have been very slow or vague, and oftentimes they've just been ineffective. We've also seen legal challenges against chocolate companies. So, for example, Nestle and Cargill, they both faced allegations for child trafficking. Sadly, once they reached the Supreme Court, these companies were able to dismiss these cases and nothing actually came about from them. So you can see why it would be kind of hopeless to even try to take legal action against these companies when we've seen this happen in the past. So there also are ethical certification programs. So what that would be was these kind of stamps on the bottom of the screen there. You would see those on your chocolate products. And what that's supposed to tell you is that your product is ethically sourced. Unfortunately, this only covers about 10% of cocoa farms. And oftentimes you're even going to see it just working as a marketing scheme. So if you have a chocolate product with this ethical certification versus one without, you're probably going to choose the one with the certification, although even the certifiers themselves say that they cannot guarantee that this chocolate is ethically sourced. So moving on to reform efforts and their limits. Over the past 2 decades, we've seen many different groups, such as advocacy groups, the governments, the chocolate companies themselves. They have tried to reform the chocolate industry, but the major challenges do still exist, and enforcement overall has been very weak. So starting with the Harkin-Engel Protocol, this was signed in 2001 by major chocolate companies. Their goal was to end the worst forms of child labor. They set a goal for 2005, they missed that deadline. Set another goal for 2008, missed that deadline. Set another goal for 2010 and missed that deadline as well. Their latest deadline, they actually brought their goal down to just 70% of child labor being eliminated. That was for 2020. And after that deadline was met, they actually saw that child labor rates had increased. So I started with this one just so you can kind of get a good demonstration of what a lot of the reform in this industry has looked like. So they set goals, but ultimately they have never really been met, and they haven't made real systemic change. So just looking at a couple other laws and legislative efforts, in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, you can see that in the countries themselves, they put some laws to work. And then on a broader scale, in the UK and the US, they've also tried to make some laws work as well. Ultimately, these had good frameworks, and they were helpful to raise awareness, but they had weak monitoring, weak funding, and weak enforcement, so nothing real came about these again. So what has the industry done themselves? There's a long list up there of a few of the chocolate companies that have launched programs. A lot of these programs look very similar. They all had main focuses of sustainable farming, so that would be looking back at that deforestation, better incomes for farmers, and then obviously protecting children from child labor. And you can see a few of their kind of symbols at the bottom there. And although these did bring awareness, there are a lot of limits to these company programs. So traceability is still weak. We cannot trace the supply chains all the way back to the initial farm. And a lot of the profits are still staying with the corporation rather than giving better wages to the farmers. There also has been accusations of greenwashing. So this kind of refers back to the marketing scheme where if you see, oh, Hershey put out this program, but then we look at the facts and notice that, well, it really didn't do anything. It was more just to say we did something, but the facts say differently. So lastly, looking at possible solutions. In order for us to end child labor, it would take a collaboration from everyone involved. So this would be governments, non-government organizations, farmers, companies, and consumers. What can we do? Obviously, we know poverty is the root cause, so giving fair wages to farmers and people working on the farms. Number two, education would be a good way to keep children out of the fields and kind of give them better insight for their future. Number three, looking at community programs and apprenticeships. This would be more focused for older children or maybe children of college age who don't want to work on the farm but they don't know what else to do. And then lastly, empowering farmers. So just listening to our farmers and hearing their voices and what they need in order for their farms to keep running. So the power of consumers. I kind of included this slide for the audience. So now that you guys know about this problem, you're thinking, well, what can I do? And what's my role? So buying fair trade and ethically sourced chocolate. I mean, the certification programs are not they're not the best step yet, but they are a good step in the right direction. And then just pressuring companies for transparency. Speak this story to your friends and family. And then you could join advocacy groups, and that would be for long-term impact. So overall, it is time for change. We know that the cocoa issue is not a modern issue. This is rooted in poverty, history, lack of education, and weak regulation. Efforts so far have not gone far enough, and if we want to see real change, we need to address the root causes of this issue. So that would be improving fair wages, improving access to education, and building stronger communities. And on top of that, we need to see pressure from us consumers and chocolate companies as well. And hopefully in doing so, we can build a just and child labor-free cocoa industry. So then here are my references. These are compiled from a lot of different sources, advocacy groups, non-government organizations, academic journals, chocolate companies themselves, government publications, and international organizations as well. Any questions?
I may have missed something, but I'm seeking a little more detail.
Okay.
In 1906, when Cadbury moved their farms from Chocolate Islands to Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire,